Before we begin, please subscribe and click like. And tell me, from which city or country are you listening? The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of the Valmont Palace cast long shadows across the Persian carpets, but Sophie de Valmont sat perfectly still in her chair, noticing nothing of the golden Parisian sunset. At 7 years old, she had already learned that stillness was safer than movement, silence more acceptable than the frustrated sounds that sometimes escaped her throat when no one understood. Her small hands clutched a piece of charcoal, sketching yet another portrait of the woman whose face haunted every waking moment. Her mother, Princess Eloise, dead these 6 months from the tuberculosis that had wasted her elegant frame to nothing. The servants passed through the drawing room with practiced invisibility, their eyes sliding over the small figure as if she were simply another piece of furniture. A maid adjusted the curtains. A footman collected the tea service. Neither acknowledged the child who sat among them, lost in her world of pencil strokes and memories. Sophie's drawings littered the floor around her chair, dozens of attempts to capture her mother's smile, the particular way Eloise's eyes had crinkled at the corners when she laughed, the gentle curve of her fingers forming the signs that had been their private language. Every sketch was imperfect. Everyone made Sophie's chest ache with the impossibility of bringing back what was lost. The double doors burst open with enough force to make the servants jump. Prince Alexandre de Valmont entered like a storm cloud, all dark elegance and barely contained emotion. At 32, he was devastating to look at, with the kind of aristocratic beauty that made Parisian society whisper behind fans and gloved hands. Black hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of winter storms. He still wore mourning clothes, the severe black making his pale complexion even more striking. Those storm-grey eyes immediately sought his daughter. Sophie didn't look up. She'd learned that too, that even when her father entered a room with all his princely presence, it changed nothing. He couldn't hear her any more than the servants could. The language her mother had spent years teaching her, the intricate movements of hands and fingers that had allowed Sophie to express every thought and feeling, had died with Eloise. Now there was only the terrible silence, the frustration of being trapped inside herself with no way out. Alexandre approached slowly, as if his daughter were a wild creature who might startle. He knelt beside her chair, his expensive wool trousers creasing against the floor. "Sophie," he said softly, then realized the futility of spoken words and tried again with clumsy gestures, pointing to the drawings, then to her, raising his eyebrows in what he hoped conveyed a question. Sophie glanced at him, and for a moment her small hands began to move in the fluid, expressive language her mother had taught her. Her fingers shaped words, questions, needs, but her father's face remained blank with incomprehension. She signed faster, more desperately, and he reached out to still her hands, his own expression crumbling into helpless frustration. "I don't understand," Alexandre whispered, and the admission felt like swallowing glass. "Mon Dieu, I don't understand." Sophie's face contorted. Her hands jerked from his grasp, and she swept the drawings from the table in a sudden violent motion. Charcoal sketches of her dead mother scattered across the marble floor like fallen leaves. The child's mouth opened in a soundless cry of anguish, not truly soundless but close enough, a thin keening that made Alexandre's heart fracture. He tried to gather her into his arms, but she fought him, small fists beating against his chest, her whole body rigid with months of accumulated grief and isolation. The servants watched from doorways, uncertain whether to intervene. Eventually, Sophie's struggles weakened, and she collapsed against her father's shoulder, shaking with silent sobs. Alexandre held her, this small creature who was all he had left of Eloise, and felt his own tears slip free. They stayed that way for long minutes, locked in shared misery neither could articulate to the other. The click of heels on marble announced another presence. Duchess Margot de Valmont, Eloise's mother and Sophie's grandmother, stood in the doorway with the rigid posture of old French aristocracy. She was 70, thin as a blade, with silver hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a black lace veil. Her eyes, so like her dead daughter's, held none of Eloise's warmth. "Still this drama?" Margot's voice cut through the room like a knife through silk. "Alexandre, we must speak. Not now," Alexandre said without looking up, his arms still wrapped around Sophie. "Yes, now." Margot stepped fully into the room, her black mourning dress rustling. "The child cannot continue this way. There are institutions, excellent ones, where children with her condition are properly cared for. You cannot manage her alone." Alexandre's head snapped up. eyes blazing. She stays with me. Be reasonable. You're a prince of France, cousin to the emperor himself. You have duties, obligations. How can you fulfill them while playing nursemaid to a child who cannot even— She is my daughter. Alexandra's voice dropped to something dangerous. She stays. Margot's lips thinned. Eloise spoiled her, teaching her that hand language. It only made things worse. The girl should have been trained to read lips, to attempt speech. Instead, my daughter indulged this fantasy that Sophie could be treated as normal. Sophie is normal, Alexandra said, each word precise and cold. She simply cannot hear. There's a difference that will haunt this family unless addressed properly. Margot gathered her skirts. Think on it, Alexandra. The longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes. There are boarding schools in Switzerland that specialize in such cases. No one in Paris need even know. She swept from the room, leaving only the scent of her perfume and the weight of her words. Sophie had stopped crying. She pulled back from her father's embrace and looked at him with those enormous dark eyes, Eloise's eyes, and Alexandra saw the question there even without shared language. Are you going to send me away? He cupped her small face in his hands, shaking his head vehemently. She couldn't hear his words, but perhaps she could read his intentions in his expression. Never, he mouthed slowly. Never, ma petite, I promise. But the promise felt hollow even as he made it. What kind of life was this for her? Trapped in silence, unable to communicate, isolated even in a house full of people. Eloise had known how to reach her, had built a bridge of understanding that Sophie could cross. With his wife gone, that bridge had collapsed, leaving his daughter stranded on the far shore. That night, long after Sophie had cried herself to exhausted sleep, Alexandra stood in his late wife's sitting room. He hadn't changed anything in the 6 months since her death, couldn't bear to disturb the arrangement of her things, as if by preserving the physical space he might preserve something of her presence. Her writing desk still held half-finished correspondence. Her embroidery lay abandoned in its basket. And on the shelf, Alexandra found what he'd been looking for without knowing it. A journal bound in green leather, filled with Eloise's elegant handwriting. He opened it at random and found sketches, hundreds of them, hands in different positions, fingers forming shapes, each accompanied by a French word written beneath. This was it, the dictionary of signs that Eloise had created to speak with their daughter. Alexandra sat heavily in his wife's chair and began to read. The journal's early entries were dated 7 years ago, just after Sophie's birth and the scarlet fever that had stolen her hearing. I will not let my daughter live in silence, Eloise had written. If she cannot hear words, then I will learn another language. We both will. And we will speak to each other across any barrier. The entries documented Eloise's determination, her research into the Institut National de Jeunes Sourds, her secret visits there to learn from the teachers, her patient hours teaching Sophie as the child grew. Eloise had kept it all hidden from the family, from society, knowing that the French aristocracy would view Sophie's deafness as a shameful defect to be concealed. Alexandra traced his fingers over the sketches of hands, trying to memorize the positions, but they blurred together. How had Eloise done this alone? How had she managed to keep this entire world secret while smiling through court functions and family gatherings? I failed you, he whispered to the empty room. I let you carry this by yourself, and now Sophie pays the price for my ignorance. He closed the journal and pressed it against his chest, as if proximity to Eloise's words could somehow transfer her knowledge to him. But he remained as helpless as before, a prince with all the power in the world, and none of the ability to reach his own child. In her bedroom down the hall, Sophie slept fitfully, dreaming of her mother's hands forming words she could no longer remember. The morning sun had barely climbed over the rooftops of Montmartre when Marguerite Beaumont lit her first candle. The atelier she shared with 3 other seamstresses was a modest affair, 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from supporting the weight of too many lives. The main room held 4 work tables crowded with fabric and thread, while the back room served as sleeping quarters, 4 narrow beds pressed against the walls. Marguerite moved quietly, not wanting to wake the others. At 26, she was the eldest of the seamstresses, though Madame Claudette, who owned the atelier, was nearly 50. The other girls, Marie and Lisette, were barely 18, country girls who'd come to Paris seeking fortune and found only needles and long hours instead. She settled at her work table and pulled out the dress she'd been working on for 3 days, a simple day dress in blue cotton for a merchant's wife in the Marais. The stitches had to be perfect, invisible, the kind of craftsmanship that allowed Madame Claudette's modest atelier to compete with the grander establishments on the Rue de la Paix. Marguerite's fingers moved with practiced precision, each stitch exactly the same length as the last. This had been her life for 12 years now, since she'd been orphaned at 14. The cholera epidemic of 1854 had swept through Paris like a scythe, taking both her parents within days of each other. Her father, a clerk in a legal office, her mother, a schoolteacher, respectable working-class people who'd saved enough to give their only daughter some education, some hope of a better life. Then the fever came, and Marguerite found herself alone at 14, with a few francs in her pocket and nowhere to go. Madame Claudette had found her sleeping in the doorway of the atelier one November morning, shivering in a threadbare dress. Instead of chasing her away, the older woman had looked at Marguerite's hands, long fingers, neat nails despite the dirt, and said, "Can you sew?" "My mother taught me," Marguerite had whispered. "Then come inside before you freeze to death. We'll see if you're worth the bread you'll eat." 12 years later, Marguerite was still here. Not because she couldn't do better. Her skill with a needle had improved to the point where Madame Claudette relied on her for the most delicate work, but because this place was safe, known. The other seamstresses had become something like sisters. Madame Claudette, with her sharp tongue and sharper eye for stitching, was the closest thing to family Marguerite had left. The sun rose higher, painting the atelier walls gold. Marie and Lisette woke, yawning, and began their own work. Madame Claudette arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, as she did every morning, carrying fresh bread and yesterday's gossip from the baker. "There's drama at the Valmont Palace," she announced, tearing the bread into pieces. "The baker's sister works there, says the prince has gone half mad with grief over his dead wife, won't go to court, won't see anyone, just sits in that palace with his mute daughter." "Mute?" Marie asked, pausing in her work. "Deaf and mute, the girl, 7 years old." Madame Claudette shook her head. "The late princess coddled her, they say, kept her hidden away like some dark secret. Now with the mother gone, no one knows what to do with the child. The prince can't even communicate with her." Marguerite's hands stilled on her stitching. A deaf child, 7 years old, 6 months orphaned of her mother. "How terrible," Lisette murmured, "to be so alone in the world." "She's a princess," Marie said dismissively. "I'm sure she'll survive in her palace with servants to attend her every need." But Marguerite understood something the younger girls didn't. She'd seen enough in her years of volunteer work at the Institut National de Jeunes Sourds to know that wealth meant nothing if you couldn't make yourself understood. A deaf child in a hearing world, especially one who'd lost her only interpreter, that child was drowning, palace or no palace. The Institute. She would go there today, even though it was Thursday, and she usually reserved her visits for Sundays. The sisters there would want to know about this, and perhaps there was something that could be done. Madame Claudette clapped her hands. "Enough gossip. We have work. Marguerite, I need you to finish that blue dress by noon. The merchant's wife is coming to collect it. Marie, Lisette, the embroidery on the evening gown must be completed today." They bent to their tasks. Outside, Paris woke fully. The rattle of carriages, the calls of street vendors, the endless motion of the city. Marguerite worked steadily until noon, then wrapped the completed dress in paper and tied it with string. "I'll deliver this and then make a quick stop at the Institute," she told Madame Claudette. "I'll be back by 3 to start on the green silk." Madame Claudette studied her with knowing eyes. "The deaf school? This is about the Valmont girl, isn't it? I just want to ask Sister Marie-Thérèse if there's anything that can be done. The child must be terrified." "Marguerite," Madame Claudette's voice softened, "you have a good heart, too good sometimes. But that girl lives in a different world than ours. Even if the sisters know something that could help, do you think a prince would listen to a poor seamstress?" "Probably not," Marguerite admitted, "but I have to try." She delivered the dress, collected payment, and then turned her steps toward the eastern edge of Paris, where the Institute occupied a cluster of old buildings near the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The walk took 40 minutes, but Marguerite didn't mind. It gave her time to think, to remember. The Institut National de Jeunes Sourds, the National Institute for Deaf Youth, had been founded nearly a century earlier, pioneering the education of deaf children through sign language. It was a revolutionary idea at the time, the notion that children who couldn't hear might still be educated, might still have thoughts worth expressing. The Institute had developed French Sign Language, codified it, proved that deaf children could learn, could thrive, could become full participants in society. Marguerite had first come here 5 years ago, looking for a way to be useful on her rare days off. The sisters who ran the institute needed help with practical matters, cooking, cleaning, mending the children's clothes. Marguerite had offered to sew for them, free of charge. What she hadn't expected was how the children themselves would capture her heart. There were 20 students currently at the institute, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Some had been born deaf. Others, like little Sophie de Valmont, had lost their hearing to childhood illnesses. They came from poor families who couldn't afford private tutors, families who'd heard somehow about this place, where their defective children might learn something useful. Marguerite had spent her first month simply watching, fascinated by the way the children's hands moved, fluid, expressive, creating a language in the air. Sister Marie-Thérèse, who'd spent 30 years at the institute, had noticed her interest. "Would you like to learn?" the elderly nun had asked. "Could I? If you're willing to work at it. Sign language is as complex as any spoken language. It requires dedication." Marguerite had learned. She'd studied the signs the way some people studied Latin or Greek, practicing the hand shapes in her room at night, testing herself on vocabulary during her walk to work. The children became her teachers, giggling when she made mistakes, patient when she struggled with complicated phrases. Now, 5 years later, she was fluent. She could converse with the children about anything, their dreams, their fears, their opinions on whether cats were superior to dogs. She could tell them stories, make them laugh, comfort them when they cried. The ability to bridge that gap between the hearing and deaf worlds felt like a gift she'd been given for no particular reason, and she tried to use it well. Sister Marie-Thérèse was in the garden with several of the younger children when Marguerite arrived. The nun's wrinkled face lit up in welcome. "Marguerite, we weren't expecting you until Sunday." "I know, I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I heard something this morning that troubled me." Marguerite glanced at the children, who were watching her with interest. She signed a quick greeting, and they responded enthusiastically before returning to their game. Sister Marie-Thérèse led her to a bench beneath an old chestnut tree. "What troubles you, child?" "The Prince de Valmont's daughter, Sophie. Is she known to you?" The nun's expression grew solemn. "Yes. Princess Eloise came here several times years ago when she learned her daughter was deaf. I taught her sign language myself. She was a devoted student, that poor lady, determined that her daughter would not be silenced." Sister Marie-Thérèse paused. "We heard of her death, and we worried about the child, but—" She spread her hands helplessly. "We are a small institute with limited resources. We serve the poor. A prince's daughter is beyond our reach." "But she's not beyond need," Marguerite said urgently. "Madame Claudette said no one at the palace can communicate with her. 6 months without anyone who understands sign language. Sister, that child must be drowning." "I'm sure she is, but what can we do?" "The aristocracy guards its privacy jealously. They would never accept help from an institute that serves the poor. It would be an admission that their child belongs in our world, not theirs. Then someone needs to go to them, someone who can bridge both worlds." Sister Marie-Thérèse looked at Marguerite steadily. "Someone like you?" "I don't know." Marguerite twisted her hands in her lap. "I don't know anything about palaces or princes, but I know about deaf children. I know what it feels like to be orphaned and alone. If there's any way I could help—" The nun was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and covered Marguerite's hands with her own, stilling their anxious movement. "You have a generous soul, but the world is not often kind to generosity, especially when it crosses social boundaries. If you truly wish to help this child, you must be prepared for rejection, for insult, for doors closed in your face." "I know. Do you? You come from respectable working people. You've never faced the contempt the truly wealthy reserve for those they consider beneath them. It can be crushing." Marguerite thought of the 14-year-old girl sleeping in doorways, of the first winter alone when she'd nearly frozen rather than beg. "I've been crushed before, sister. I survived." Sister Marie-Thérèse smiled sadly. "Then may God go with you. But I have no advice on how to approach a prince. That you must navigate yourself." As it turned out, Marguerite didn't have to navigate anything. Fate, or perhaps divine intervention, intervened 3 days later, when Madame Claudette came rushing into the atelier with news that sent all the seamstresses into a flurry. "The Valmont Palace," she announced breathlessly. "Their regular seamstress has taken ill. Something with her lungs. They need someone immediately to adjust several dresses for the prince's daughter. It's emergency work, but it pays triple our usual rate." Marie and Lisette both reached for their sewing baskets, but Madame Claudette shook her head. "Not you two. This requires someone with experience. someone who won't be intimidated by servants and luxury. Marguerite, you'll go. Me? Marguerite's heart began to pound. This was it. The chance she'd been praying for, delivered as if her thoughts had conjured it into being. Yes, you. Can you be ready to leave within the hour? Yes, of course. Madame Claudette studied her with narrowed eyes. Why do you look like someone just granted your dearest wish? It's a sewing job, not an invitation to the imperial ball. Marguerite ducked her head, gathering her supplies. I'm just honored to represent the atelier at such a prestigious house. Madame Claudette didn't sound convinced, but she let it drop. Take your best needles, your finest thread, and for heaven's sake, don't speak unless spoken to. The aristocracy doesn't like chatty servants. An hour later, Marguerite stood on the street outside the Valmont Palace, her sewing basket clutched in both hands, trying not to let her courage falter. The building was magnificent, 3 stories of cream-colored stone, tall windows reflecting the afternoon sun, wrought iron balconies dripping with late-season roses. This was the home of princes, of people whose daily lives she couldn't even imagine. She thought of Sophie, trapped somewhere inside those beautiful walls, alone and unheard. Then she climbed the steps and knocked on the servants' entrance. The housekeeper who answered the door looked Marguerite up and down with the particular disdain servants in grand houses reserved for visitors they considered beneath notice. You're from Claudette's atelier? Yes, madame, I'm here to adjust dresses for the young lady. About time. Follow me, and mind you don't touch anything. The servants' corridors were a maze of narrow passages and back stairs, a hidden world behind the grandeur visible from the street. Marguerite caught glimpses through doorways, a library with walls of books, a dining room that could seat 40, a ballroom with chandeliers that must hold 1,000 candles. The wealth was almost obscene in its abundance. They climbed to the 2nd floor, and the housekeeper knocked sharply on a door before entering without waiting for a response. The seamstress is here, Mademoiselle Sophie. Try to behave yourself. The room Marguerite entered was fit for a princess. Canopied bed with silk curtains, walls painted pale blue, dolls arranged on shelves, a child's escritoire by the window. But the princess herself sat rigid in a straight-backed chair, her small face set in an expression of miserable endurance. Sophie de Valmont was tiny for 7, with her father's dark hair and enormous eyes that were far too old for her young face. She wore a simple day dress, pale green with white ribbons, and her hands were clenched in her lap. A maid stood nearby, holding another dress, the one that presumably needed adjusting. The maid curtsied perfunctorily to Marguerite. This is the dress for the family dinner tomorrow. It needs to be taken in at the shoulders and shortened by 2 inches. The child has lost weight. Marguerite heard the words but focused on Sophie. The girl was staring at nothing, her whole body radiating defeat. This was what 6 months of isolation had done, turned a child into a statue, blank and unreachable. If you'll just stand still, mademoiselle, the maid said, reaching for Sophie. Sophie flinched away, and her hands began to move, rapid, frustrated gestures that Marguerite recognized immediately as sign language. The child was trying to communicate something, but the maid just grabbed her shoulders and hauled her to her feet. None of that nonsense. Stand still. Sophie's gestures became more frantic. She was signing the same thing over and over. No, I don't like it, the lace hurts. The maid forced the dress over Sophie's head, and the child's face crumpled. She tried to pull the dress off, signing desperately, but no one paid attention. The maid held her in place, and the housekeeper tisked disapprovingly. Always this drama with her. Just do the alterations quickly, so we can remove this ridiculous garment. Marguerite had been standing frozen, watching the scene with growing horror. Now she moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 steps and kneeling in front of Sophie. Her hands rose, forming the signs before conscious thought could stop her. You don't like the dress because the lace irritates your neck, yes? Sophie's hands stopped mid-gesture. Her whole body went still. Those enormous eyes focused on Marguerite with such sudden, desperate intensity that it was like being struck by lightning. You understand? Sophie signed, her small hands shaking. You understand me? Yes, mon cœur. Marguerite signed back, tears already forming. I understand you. The child made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and launched herself at Marguerite, nearly knocking her over. Small arms wrapped around Marguerite's neck with desperate strength, and Sophie began to cry in great shuddering sobs that shook her whole frame. I thought no one would ever understand me again. Sophie signed against Marguerite's shoulder, her fingers clumsy with emotion. I thought I was alone forever. Maman died and took all the words with her. Marguerite held the child close, her own tears falling freely now. You're not alone. Not anymore. I'm here. I hear you. What is the meaning of this? The housekeeper's voice cracked like a whip, but before she could continue, another voice cut through the room. What's happening here? Prince Alexandre de Valmont stood in the doorway, and even in her emotional state, Marguerite registered the impact of his presence. He was even more striking in person than she'd imagined, tall, aristocratic, with those grey eyes that seemed to look straight through her. But right now those eyes were fixed on his daughter, and the expression in them was pure anguish. Sophie saw her father and signed frantically, "Papa! Papa! She understands! This lady understands me!" Alexandre stared at Marguerite, still kneeling on the floor with his daughter in her arms. How are you speaking to her?" Marguerite gently detached Sophie and stood, dropping into a proper curtsy despite her shaking legs. "Sign language, Your Highness. French Sign Language. I learned it at the Institut National de Jeunes Sourds. You know this language my wife used?" Alexandre's voice was barely above a whisper. He took a step into the room, then another, his eyes never leaving Marguerite's face. "You can understand what Sophie is saying?" "Yes, Your Highness." "Tell me." The prince's composure cracked. "Tell me what she's saying right now." Marguerite glanced at Sophie, whose hands were moving again, slower now but no less emphatic. She says the dress you want her to wear has lace that scratches her neck. She tried to tell the maid, but no one understood. She's asking if you can please let her wear the blue dress instead, the one without lace." Alexandre's face transformed, comprehension, relief, and grief all at once. He dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, ignoring the scandalous informality of the position. "Sophie, ma petite Sophie, is that true? The lace hurts?" Sophie nodded vigorously, and her hands formed words that Marguerite translated without being asked. "It's been hurting for weeks, but you didn't understand when I tried to tell you." Mon Dieu. Alexandre reached out and touched his daughter's face with infinite gentleness. Then he looked up at Marguerite, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "How long have you known this language?" 5 years, Your Highness. I volunteer at the Institute, and I learned from the children there. 5 years. Alexandre stood slowly, still looking at Marguerite, as if she were some kind of miraculous apparition. "In 5 years, you learned what I should have learned when Sophie was born, what I should have learned to help my wife instead of forcing her to carry this burden alone." The rawness in his voice made Marguerite's chest ache. "To Your Highness, can you stay?" The words came out in a rush, desperate and unprincely. "Not just for the sewing. Can you stay and teach me to speak to my daughter?" The housekeeper made a shocked sound. "Your Highness, surely you cannot be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting, I'm begging." Alexandre turned to her with the full force of his aristocratic authority. "Madame Duchamp, leave us. Take the others with you. I need to speak with Mademoiselle Beaumont, Your Highness." Marguerite Beaumont. "Mademoiselle Beaumont, alone with my daughter." The housekeeper's face went through several shades of outrage, but she knew better than to argue with a prince in this mood. She and the maid withdrew, closing the door with a sharp click that conveyed disapproval as clearly as words. For a moment, the three of them simply stood there, Prince, Seamstress, and the child who had just found her voice again. Sophie clung to Marguerite's hand, her grip tight enough to hurt, as if afraid that letting go would make this miraculous woman disappear. Alexandre ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its careful styling. "Forgive me, I should not have dismissed the servants so abruptly, but I couldn't." He gestured helplessly. "For 6 months, I've watched my daughter slip further and further away. I've tried everything I could think of to reach her, but it was like watching someone drown while standing safely on shore. And then you appear, and in one moment, you do what I haven't been able to do since my wife died." "Your Highness," Marguerite said carefully, "I understand that you're grateful, but surely there are others who could teach you sign language. The Institute has several teachers. Will they come here, to a palace, to work with an aristocrat?" Alexandre's smile was bitter. "My family has never been known for its progressive views, Mademoiselle Beaumont. If I bring teachers from the Institute, it will be seen as an admission that Sophie is defective, damaged goods, the kind of child who should be hidden away, not paraded as the daughter of a prince." "She's not defective," Marguerite said sharply, forgetting for a moment whom she was addressing. "She's deaf. There's a difference." "I know that." Alexandre's voice rose, then fell again. "I know, but the world doesn't. My own mother-in-law wants me to send Sophie to a boarding school in Switzerland, somewhere far away where her condition won't embarrass the family. She's 7 years old, and they want me to exile her." Sophie was watching them both, her eyes moving from face to face as they spoke. She tugged on Marguerite's sleeve, and when the seamstress looked down, the child signed, "What is Papa saying?" Marguerite translated, then signed Sophie's question to Alexandre. For a moment, she saw the naked pain in the prince's face as he realized how much of his world Sophie had been missing. "Tell her," he said hoarsely. "Tell her that I'm asking you to stay, to teach me how to talk to her. Tell her that I'm sorry it took me so long to find someone who could help us." Marguerite's hands moved, translating, and Sophie's face lit up. She signed back, rapid and excited, and Marguerite felt her throat tighten at the child's words. She says you're not stupid, Papa. You just didn't know. And now that the nice lady is here, everything will be better. She says she hasn't been this happy since Maman died." Alexandre made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He reached for his daughter, and Sophie went to him willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck. Over her dark hair, the prince looked at Marguerite. "I'll pay you whatever you ask. Double what the Institute would pay its best teacher. Triple. I don't care about the cost. Just please stay and help me reach my daughter." Marguerite thought of Madame Claudette, of the other seamstresses, of her small, safe life in the atelier. Then she looked at Sophie, who was watching her with desperate hope, and knew that she couldn't walk away from this child any more than she could stop breathing. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "But I don't want triple pay, Your Highness. Just let me help her. Let me teach you both. That's payment enough." She didn't mention that she'd already decided to help for free if necessary, that Sophie's isolation had been haunting her for days, that this felt less like a decision and more like destiny. Alexandre closed his eyes briefly, his relief palpable. "Thank you. I don't know what divine providence brought you through our doors today, but I will be grateful for it for the rest of my life." Divine providence, Marguerite thought, or perhaps just the illness of a seamstress and the desperation of a grieving father. But as she watched Sophie smile, truly smile, bright and unguarded, for the first time since she'd entered this room, she decided that perhaps they were the same thing. "When can you begin?" Alexandre asked. "Immediately, if you wish. The dress alterations can wait." "Then let's not waste another moment." The prince managed a real smile, and Marguerite caught a glimpse of what he must have been like before grief had carved him hollow. "We have much to learn, and my daughter has months of conversation to catch up on." Sophie was already signing to Marguerite, a stream of questions and observations that had been pent up for half a year. What was the lady's name? Where did she learn signs? Did she know other children who used signs? Could she stay forever and ever? Marguerite answered each question patiently, marveling at how quickly Sophie had gone from shut down to animated. Alexandre watched them, his expression complex. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down, formal posture abandoned. "All right," he said. "Teach me. Teach me how to speak to my daughter. Starting now." And so, in a princess's bedroom in a palace in Paris, the first lesson began. Marguerite showed Alexandre the basic signs. Hello, goodbye, yes, no, I love you. His hands were large and aristocratic, unused to the precise shapes required, but he practiced with the focused intensity of someone who had no choice but to succeed. Sophie helped, giggling when her father made mistakes, gently correcting his hand positions. It was the first time in months that father and daughter had truly interacted, and the joy of it filled the room like sunlight. Outside, in the servants' passages, Madame Duchamp listened at the door and frowned. Nothing good would come of this, she was certain. A common seamstress teaching a prince as if she were his equal. The scandal would be enormous. But inside the room, the three people learning to speak across silence paid no attention to potential scandals. They were too busy discovering that even the widest gaps could be bridged with patience, dedication, and the movement of hands in air. The first week passed in a blur of signs and translations, and Marguerite felt herself being absorbed into the strange rhythms of palace life. Alexandre had been as good as his word, better even. He'd had a room prepared for her in the family wing of the palace, not relegated to servants' quarters, and when Madame Duchamp had objected to the impropriety, he'd silenced her with a look that could have frozen wine. "Mademoiselle Beaumont is not a servant," he'd said coldly. "She is Sophie's teacher and will be treated as such." The room they'd given her was larger than the entire atelier in Montmartre. Marguerite stood in the center of it that first night, turning slowly to take in the rosewood furniture, the silk bed curtains, the window overlooking the palace gardens. It felt wrong somehow, as if she'd stolen into a life that didn't belong to her. But then Sophie had knocked on her door already in her nightgown and signed, "Can I stay with you tonight? I'm afraid you'll disappear by morning." Marguerite had let the child climb into her bed, and they'd lain awake signing stories to each other until Sophie finally drifted off. The trust in that small gesture, the way Sophie had curled against her side as if she belonged there, had settled something in Marguerite's chest. This was right. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the social awkwardness, this was where she was meant to be. Now, a week later, she sat in the library with Alexandra for their nightly lesson. It had become a ritual. After Sophie was tucked in bed, father and teacher would meet to practice the more complex aspects of sign language. Alexandra was a dedicated student, practicing for hours, but his hands still moved with aristocratic stiffness. "Loosen your wrists," Marguerite said for the 100th time. "Sign language is fluid, not rigid. Think of it like conducting music, not chopping wood." Alexandra attempted the sign for beautiful again, and this time got it almost right. He smiled, one of the real smiles that transformed his face, and Marguerite felt her heart skip treacherously. She'd been trying very hard not to notice how devastating he was when he smiled, how the grief that usually haunted his eyes cleared when he focused on learning. "Better?" he asked. "Much better. Try stringing together a sentence now. Sophie is beautiful." His hands moved. Sophie. He'd mastered his daughter's name sign early. Is beautiful. The signs flowed together more smoothly than they had just days ago. "Excellent. You're learning faster than any student I've ever had. I'm motivated." Alexandra flexed his fingers, then poured them both glasses of wine from the decanter on the side table. This had also become part of their ritual, this small relaxation after the intensity of lessons. "Tell me about the Institute. How did you become involved there?" Marguerite accepted the wine, still slightly uncomfortable with the intimacy of these evening sessions. A seamstress and a prince, alone in a library, drinking wine and talking. It was so far outside the bounds of propriety that she tried not to think about it. "I told you, I needed something to do on my days off and they needed help with sewing. But that doesn't explain why you learned sign language. Most volunteers would have mended clothes and left it at that." She was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. But there was something about the late hour, the candlelight, Alexandra's genuine interest, that made her want to be honest. "I was lonely," she said finally. "After my parents died, I had no family. The other seamstresses are kind, but they have their own lives, their own families to return to on Sundays. I had nothing, no one. And then I started spending time at the Institute, and those children, they understood loneliness. They understood what it felt like to be isolated even in a crowded room. So I learned their language because I wanted to be less alone, and I wanted them to be less alone too." Alexandra studied her with those piercing grey eyes. "You have a remarkable capacity for empathy, Mademoiselle Beaumont. I just know what it feels like to need someone to see you. Really see you, not as a problem or an obligation, but as a person." She met his gaze. "The way Sophie needed someone to see her. The way I failed to see her." His voice was quiet but not self-pitying. "I loved my wife desperately, Mademoiselle Beaumont. When she died, I thought I would die too. The grief was consuming, and I'm ashamed to admit that I let it consume so much that I couldn't see my own daughter drowning right in front of me. You were grieving. No one can think clearly in the depths of grief, perhaps, but Eloise would have been horrified to know that Sophie spent 6 months unable to communicate with anyone. My wife spent years building a bridge to our daughter, and I let it collapse the moment she was gone." He turned his wineglass in his hands. "Do you know what the worst part is? I was relieved when Eloise kept Sophie's sign language secret from the family. I didn't want to deal with my mother-in-law's judgment, with society's whispers. I told myself Eloise knew best, but really I was just grateful not to have to think about it. You're thinking about it now, because you're forcing me to, because watching you and Sophie together, seeing how she blossoms when someone actually speaks her language, it's made me realize what a coward I've been." He looked up at her, and the self-recrimination in his eyes was painful to witness. "You've been here a week and you've done more for my daughter than I did in her entire life." "That's not true." "It is true, and I'm grateful beyond measure, but I'm also ashamed." Marguerite set down her wineglass and leaned forward. "Your Highness, may I be frank? I wish you would. Everyone else in this palace tells me only what they think I want to hear. Self-flagellation won't help Sophie. What she needs now is a father who's present, who's learning, who's trying. And that's exactly what you're doing. So you didn't know sign language before, you're learning it now. You can't change the past 6 months, but you can make the next 6 months different. Alexandra stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and appreciation. You're quite direct for a seamstress. I'm quite direct for anyone, Marguerite said dryly. It's one of my less aristocratic qualities. I find it refreshing. He smiled again, and Marguerite felt that dangerous flutter in her chest once more. This had to stop. She couldn't start having feelings for a prince, of all people. It was absurd, impossible. But watching him practice his signs, seeing the concentration on his face as he worked to master this new language for the sake of his daughter, it was difficult not to feel something. A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Madame Duchamp entered without waiting for permission, her face tight with disapproval. Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but the Duchess Margot has arrived unexpectedly. She's waiting in the blue salon and wishes to speak with you immediately. Alexandra's expression shuttered closed. At this hour? What does she want? She didn't share her business with me, Your Highness, but she seems quite determined. She always is. Alexandra stood, smoothing his vest. I suppose I must attend to her. He glanced at Marguerite. Would you check on Sophie? She sometimes has nightmares around this time. Of course. As Marguerite left the library, she passed close enough to the blue salon to hear the Duchess's imperious voice. We must discuss this situation with the seamstress, Alexandra. The entire household is talking. Marguerite hurried away before she could hear more. She already knew what the household was saying. She'd caught the whispers, the sideways looks from servants who couldn't decide if she was elevated above her station or dangerously out of place. Sophie's room was dark except for a nightlight burning near the bed. Marguerite opened the door quietly and found the child sitting up, hugging her knees. Bad dream? She signed. Sophie nodded and held out her arms. Marguerite went to her immediately, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling the girl close. Want to tell me about it? You left, Sophie signed against her shoulder. In my dream you left and didn't come back. Papa said you'd gone away forever, and I was alone again. Oh, sweetheart, Marguerite rocked her gently. I'm not going anywhere, I promise. But what if grandmother makes you leave? I heard the servants talking. They said grandmother thinks you're inappropriate. Your grandmother doesn't decide who stays and who goes. Your father does. But what if he changes his mind? Marguerite pulled back enough to look Sophie in the eyes. Listen to me. Your father loves you more than anything in this world. He would never send away someone who makes you happy. Never. Do you promise? I promise. But even as she made the promise, Marguerite wondered if she was lying. The Duchess Margot clearly had influence over Alexandra. What if she convinced him that keeping a seamstress in his household was scandalous? What if the whispers grew loud enough that even Alexandra's dedication to his daughter couldn't overcome them? Sophie eventually drifted back to sleep, but Marguerite stayed, watching the child's peaceful face in the flickering nightlight. She'd become attached far too quickly. In just 1 week, Sophie had wrapped herself around Marguerite's heart so completely that the thought of leaving felt like imagining amputation. And Alexandra? No, she wouldn't think about Alexandra. He was grateful to her, that was all. Grateful and relieved to have someone who could help his daughter. Any warmth in his manner was simply appreciation, nothing more. She was still sitting there an hour later when Alexandra appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted, and there were new lines of tension around his mouth. How is she? He signed. He was getting good enough now to use sign language without thinking. Nightmare. She's worried I'll leave. As am I. Alexandra entered the room and sat in the chair by Sophie's bed. He watched his daughter sleep for a moment before continuing, his hands moving slowly in the dim light. Margot wants you gone. She says the servants are gossiping, that I'm causing a scandal by keeping a commoner in the family wing, that I'm disrespecting Eloise's memory by becoming too familiar with you. Marguerite's heart sank. I can move to the servants' quarters. No. The word was signed with such force that Marguerite blinked. You're not a servant. You're Sophie's teacher and her friend. You belong exactly where you are. But Your Highness, if it's causing problems, I don't care. He stood and paced to the window, his movements agitated. When he turned back, his expression was fierce. Do you know what my mother-in-law said tonight? She said that if I had any decency, I would send Sophie to a proper institution and hire a respectable governess to oversee her education remotely, as if my daughter were a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. That's horrible. I told her to leave. I told her that if she couldn't accept Sophie as she is, with you as her teacher, Then she wasn't welcome in my home. His hands clenched. She was my wife's mother. I should show her more respect, but I can't. Not when she looks at Sophie like she's defective. Marguerite stood and crossed to him. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. You did the right thing. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, and Marguerite suddenly realized how inappropriate the gesture was. She started to pull away, but Alexandra caught her hand, holding it gently. Thank you, he said quietly, speaking aloud now, for being here, for giving Sophie her voice back, for not being intimidated by my family's cruelty. Your Highness, Alexandra. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, sending sparks up her arm. When we're alone, please. Just Alexandra. That's not... We can't... Marguerite's thoughts scattered. They were standing too close. His hand was warm on hers. This was dangerous territory. You're right. He released her hand abruptly and stepped back. Forgive me, I'm overstepping. You've been kind to my daughter, and I'm taking advantage of that kindness. You're not... Marguerite stopped, unsure what she was even trying to say. That he wasn't taking advantage, that she wanted him to keep holding her hand. Both were true, and neither should be spoken aloud. They stood in awkward silence, the moment stretching between them. Finally, Marguerite curtsied, ridiculous under the circumstances, but she needed the formality to remind them both of who they were. I should go. Let you have time alone with Sophie. Yes, of course. She fled to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it with her eyes shut. This was becoming complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. Teaching Sophie, learning to navigate palace life, those challenges she'd expected. But this growing warmth between herself and Alexandra, the way her pulse raced when he smiled, the treacherous hope that bloomed whenever he looked at her with those storm-grey eyes, that was something else entirely, something impossible, something that would only lead to heartbreak. And yet, as she lay in her grand bed in her impossible room, Marguerite couldn't stop replaying the moment when Alexandra had held her hand and called her by her given name, as if she were his equal, rather than a seamstress he'd hired. In the room down the hall, Alexandra sat beside his sleeping daughter and thought of dark eyes and gentle hands, and a voice that cut through his self-pity with perfect honesty. He thought of how Marguerite looked when she signed with Sophie, her whole face lighting up with joy, how she'd stood up to him without fear when he was wallowing in guilt, how her presence in his home had made it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people lived. He thought of all these things and knew with the kind of certainty that should have terrified him that he was in serious danger of falling in love with his daughter's teacher, which was, of course, impossible. 2 months had transformed the Valmont Palace in ways no one could have predicted. Sophie, who had been a ghost haunting the corridors, now ran through the halls with the unbridled energy of a normal 7-year-old. Her laughter, that strange, unmodulated sound that deaf children make, echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. She spoke constantly now, her hands flying through signs as she shared every thought, every observation, every question that popped into her curious mind. And Alexandra had become fluent enough to keep up with her. Marguerite watched father and daughter at breakfast, their hands moving in easy conversation, and felt pride swell in her chest. This was what she'd worked for, this connection, this restoration of relationship. Sophie was asking Alexandra about his schedule for the day, and he was explaining that he had meetings at the imperial court, but would be home in time to review her arithmetic lessons. Can Marguerite come to the park with me this afternoon? Sophie signed. If she has time, you mustn't monopolize all her hours, ma petite. Mademoiselle Beaumont needs time for herself, too. Sophie turned to Marguerite with pleading eyes. Please. We can practice the new signs you taught me. I want to be able to tell you about all the flowers. Of course we can go to the park, Marguerite signed back, smiling. I could use the fresh air myself. The domestic scene was interrupted by Madame Duchamp, who entered with her customary disapproving expression. Your Highness, you have a visitor. Countess de Beauharnais wishes to pay her respects. Alexandra's hands paused mid-sign. The Countess? She's never called before. She mentioned that she'd heard you were receiving again after your period of mourning. Shall I tell her you're not at home? No, I'll receive her. He glanced at Marguerite and Sophie. Will you both join me? I have a feeling the Countess is here out of curiosity more than courtesy, and I'd like her to meet Sophie properly. Is that wise? Marguerite asked quietly. I'm not exactly... You're exactly what Sophie needs, and if the Countess has a problem with that, she can keep her opinions to herself. 10 minutes later, they were in the blue salon. Countess de Beauharnais was a woman in her 50s, still beautiful, dressed in the height of fashion. She swept in with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in society. Her eyes took in the scene: the prince, his daughter, and a young woman whose simple dress marked her as clearly not aristocratic. "Your Highness," the Countess said, curtsying gracefully, "how wonderful to see you looking well, and this must be Lady Sophie." She smiled at the child with the particular condescension adults reserve for children they find slightly distasteful. Such a pretty little thing. Sophie looked at her father questioningly, and Alexandra signed a quick translation. Sophie's face scrunched in the way it did when she was deciding whether to be polite or honest. She chose honest. "Tell her I'm not a thing," Sophie signed to Marguerite. "I'm a person." Marguerite bit back a smile and translated aloud, "Lady Sophie thanks you for the compliment, but wishes to clarify that she's a person, not a thing." The Countess's smile froze. Of course, I meant no offense." "And this," Alexandra said smoothly, "is Mademoiselle Marguerite Beaumont, Sophie's teacher and interpreter. She's been invaluable to our household." The Countess's gaze sharpened as she assessed Marguerite. "How progressive of you, Your Highness. I had heard rumors about the unusual addition to your staff, but I confess I didn't believe them. A sign language teacher. What an extraordinary solution." There was something in her tone that made Marguerite's skin prickle. The word solution sounded too much like problem. "It's not extraordinary at all," Alexandra said. "It's simply giving my daughter the ability to communicate. Every child deserves that." "Oh, naturally." The Countess settled into her chair, arranging her skirts. "I only meant that it's rather modern. In my day, children with such afflictions were quietly cared for by nurses, out of the public eye. But times change, I suppose." Sophie had been watching the Countess's lips move, and though she couldn't hear the words, she clearly sensed the disapproval. Her hands moved in sharp, angry signs. "She thinks there's something wrong with me. She thinks I should be hidden." "Sophie," Marguerite signed back gently, "not everyone understands yet, but that doesn't mean they're right." "Why are you moving your hands like that?" the Countess asked, her curiosity overcoming her manners. "Is that how she communicates? How terribly peculiar." "It's sign language," Marguerite explained, keeping her voice neutral. "It's a complete language, as complex and expressive as French. Sophie is fluent in it, but surely she could be taught to read lips instead, or to write her needs on a slate. This," she gestured vaguely at Marguerite's hands, "seems rather theatrical." Alexandra's jaw tightened. Sign language allows Sophie to express herself fully, not just communicate basic needs. She can tell jokes, ask philosophical questions, share her dreams. She's not limited by her deafness. She's only limited by other people's unwillingness to learn her language. "I see." The Countess's tone suggested she saw something quite different. "And you learned this sign language yourself, Your Highness?" "I'm still learning, but yes, I can now have real conversations with my daughter, something I couldn't do for 6 months after my wife died." "How lovely for you both." The Countess sipped her tea, then set it down with careful precision. "Forgive my bluntness, Your Highness, but there is talk about your household, about the unusual arrangements." "What kind of talk?" "Well, you must understand, a young woman living in your home, unmarried, spending hours alone with you each evening, teaching me sign language," Alexandra interrupted coldly. "In the library, with the door open. Hardly a scandalous arrangement. Perhaps not in intent, but perception matters in our circles." The Countess leaned forward confidentially. "I'm telling you this as a friend, Alexandra. People are beginning to speculate about the nature of your relationship with this girl, and the Emperor's court is not forgiving of scandal, even to those related to the imperial family." Marguerite felt her face burn. She'd known there was gossip, but hearing it stated so boldly was mortifying. She started to stand. "Perhaps I should leave you to speak privately." "Sit," Alexandra commanded, and the steel in his voice made even the Countess blink. "Mademoiselle Beaumont stays. She has every right to hear herself being discussed." "I meant no disrespect to the girl," the Countess said quickly. "I'm sure she's perfectly respectable, but you must admit the situation is irregular. A seamstress, living in the family wing, dining with you and Sophie, being treated as an equal." "She is my equal," Alexandra said flatly. "Or rather, I'm trying to become hers. She has a gift I lack, a skill I desperately needed. The fact that she was born without title doesn't diminish her value." The Countess studied him with new interest. "You truly believe that?" "I truly do." "How refreshing." She stood, her visit apparently concluded. "Well, I've said my piece. What you do with the warning is your business, of course, but I would hate to see you ostracized from society over something so easily remedied. Simply move the girl to the servants' quarters, hire a chaperone, and the gossip will die down. After she left, Sophie immediately signed. I didn't like her. She smelled like flowers, but her words were thorns. Alexandra laughed, a genuine surprised sound. That's remarkably perceptive, ma petite. He turned to Marguerite, who had been sitting in tense silence. I apologize for that. She had no right to speak about you that way. She wasn't wrong about the impropriety, Marguerite said quietly. I've been trying not to think about it, but, Your Highness, perhaps I should move to different quarters. For your reputation. No. He crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair, bringing their eyes level. I don't care about gossip. I care about Sophie. And she needs you close, not relegated to some distant corner of the palace. But the scandal, let them talk. I've endured worse. Sophie inserted herself between them, signing urgently, Don't leave. Please don't leave because of that mean lady. I'm not leaving, Marguerite assured her. I'm just suggesting a small change. No changes, Sophie signed stubbornly. Everything is perfect now. You and Papa and me. We're perfect. Over Sophie's head, Marguerite's eyes met Alexandra's. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the impossible situation they'd created, of the growing feelings neither could quite name, of the danger they were courting simply by existing in the same space. We're perfect, Alexandra echoed softly, and Marguerite wasn't sure if he was agreeing with Sophie or making a different statement entirely. The imperial ball was 3 weeks away, and the entire palace was in controlled chaos. Napoleon III himself had sent the invitation, commanding Alexandra's presence and suggesting that it was time for Lady Sophie to be formally introduced to imperial society. The implication was clear. Alexandra's period of mourning was over. It was time to rejoin the world. Sophie was excited and terrified in equal measure. She'd never been to a grand social event, and the thought of so many people, so many eyes watching her, made her anxious. She practiced her best curtsy daily and peppered Marguerite with questions. What if I do something wrong? What if people stare at me? People will definitely stare at you, Marguerite signed honestly, because you'll be the most beautiful girl there. Let them stare. But what if they realize I'm deaf? Then they'll be lucky enough to learn something new. Your father will be right beside you, and so will I. That last part was still being debated. Alexandra insisted that Marguerite accompany them. Sophie will need an interpreter. But the household staff was scandalized at the idea of a seamstress attending an imperial ball. Madame Duchamp had made her opinion known in no uncertain terms. It's one thing to have the girl teaching the child in private, the housekeeper said. It's quite another to parade her at the Tuileries Palace, as if she belongs in such company. She does belong, Alexandra had countered. Sophie belongs, and Sophie needs Marguerite. Therefore Marguerite belongs. Now with the ball approaching, Marguerite stood in Sophie's room, putting the final touches on the child's gown. She'd made it herself, unable to trust the work to anyone else. Pale blue silk with delicate embroidery, a princess dress for a real princess. Sophie twirled in front of the mirror, her face glowing with excitement. I look like a fairy tale. You look like yourself, Marguerite signed, which is better than any fairy tale. Will you wear something beautiful too? Marguerite gestured at her own simple grey dress. I'm not a guest, sweetheart. I'm there to work, to help you communicate. I'll wear something appropriate for my role. Sophie's expression turned mutinous. No, if I have to be beautiful, you have to be beautiful too. It's only fair. That's not how the world works. Then the world is stupid. Sophie crossed her arms. I'll tell Papa. He'll make you wear a pretty dress. And she did. That evening, during their regular lesson, Sophie interrupted her father's signing practice to make her demand, Papa, you have to make Marguerite wear a beautiful dress to the ball. She says she'll wear something plain, but that's not right. She should be pretty too. Alexandra looked at Marguerite, who was mortified. Sophie, your father has more important things to worry about. No, she's right, Alexandra said thoughtfully. You should have an appropriate gown for the occasion. Tomorrow we'll have a dressmaker come to take your measurements. Your Highness, I couldn't possibly... Please, he held her gaze. Let me do this. You've given Sophie so much. Allow me to give you something in return. How could she argue with that? 2 days later, a dressmaker from one of Paris's finest establishments arrived with fabric samples and designs. Marguerite chose the simplest option, a dove-grey silk that wouldn't draw attention, but the dressmaker had other ideas. Non, non, the woman said firmly. Monsieur le Prince was very specific. Something elegant, something that suits your coloring. I'm thinking deep green to bring out your eyes. Nothing too ornate, but definitely not servant's garb. The dress that resulted was the most beautiful thing Marguerite had ever owned. Deep emerald silk with a modest neckline, fitted bodice and a skirt that whispered when she moved. When she tried it on for the first fitting, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. Sophie clapped her hands with delight. "Now you look like you belong in a palace." "I don't belong in a palace," Marguerite said, but without conviction. The dress changed something about how she held herself, how she moved. For just a moment, she could almost believe the fiction that she was someone who might dance at an imperial ball. The night of the event arrived too quickly. Marguerite dressed carefully, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons at her wrists. She'd borrowed hair combs from Sophie's collection, the child had insisted, and pinned her dark hair into an elegant arrangement that took 3 attempts to get right. When she knocked on Sophie's door to help the child dress, it was Alexandre who answered. He'd clearly just finished his own preparations, formal evening wear, his hair styled back, the full regalia of his rank on display. He was devastating enough on ordinary days. Dressed for an imperial ball, he was almost painful to look at. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Mademoiselle Beaumont, Your Highness." She curtsied, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm here to help Sophie dress." "Yes, of course." But he didn't move from the doorway. You're very beautiful." Heat flooded her face. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's observation." He finally stepped aside to let her enter. "Sophie, Marguerite is here." The evening was a whirlwind of carriages and crowds, of glittering chandeliers, and music Marguerite could hear, but Sophie couldn't. The Tuileries Palace was magnificent, all gold leaf and mirrors, hundreds of aristocrats in their finest jewels, champagne flowing like water. Marguerite stayed close to Sophie, translating conversations, interpreting questions. The child handled it beautifully, her natural grace and poise winning over even the most skeptical courtiers. Alexandre stayed nearby, one hand occasionally resting on his daughter's shoulder, his presence a steady anchor. "The girl seems quite functional," one duchess remarked to Alexandre, as if Sophie were a piece of machinery being evaluated. Given her limitations, Alexandre's smile was cold enough to frost glass. "My daughter has no limitations. She simply speaks a different language than you do." Word spread quickly through the ballroom that Prince de Valmont's deaf daughter was not only present, but thriving. Some aristocrats were genuinely curious, asking Marguerite intelligent questions about sign language. Others were less kind, whispering behind fans about the poor afflicted child and how brave the prince is to bring her into public. Sophie handled the attention with surprising maturity. When a particularly pompous count asked Alexandre if she understood anything being said, Sophie tapped Marguerite's arm and signed, "Tell him I understand everything important. I understand that he wears a ridiculous wig and thinks too highly of himself." Marguerite translated a much more diplomatic version, but Alexandre caught his daughter's actual words and had to turn away to hide his laughter. As the evening progressed, Marguerite found herself relaxing slightly. She'd been terrified of making some horrible social gaffe, but Sophie's needs gave her purpose, a role to fulfill that justified her presence. She was here to work, not to socialize, and that framework made everything manageable, until Alexandre asked her to dance. They were standing in the palace gardens, taking a break from the ballroom's heat. Sophie had gone with a kind lady-in-waiting to see the emperor's collection of mechanical birds, leaving Marguerite and Alexandre alone under a sky full of stars. "Dance with me," Alexandre said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Your Highness, I don't think—" "One dance, in the garden where no one can see us. I want to thank you properly for everything you've done. You don't need to thank me by dancing." "I'm not thanking you." He held out his hand. "I'm asking because I want to, because you look beautiful tonight, and the music is lovely, and for once, I'm not drowning in grief. Please, Marguerite, one dance." She should refuse. It was too intimate, too dangerous. But his use of her first name, the way he was looking at her in the moonlight, the distant waltz music drifting from the ballroom, it all conspired to make her take his hand. They danced in a shadowed corner of the garden, away from prying eyes. Alexandre was an excellent dancer, and he led her through the steps with easy confidence. Marguerite had learned to dance as a girl. Her mother had insisted on it, but she'd never danced like this with someone who made her feel graceful rather than clumsy. "You're a good dancer," Alexandre murmured. "You sound surprised." I'm realizing there's a great deal I don't know about you, your past, your family, what you dream about when you're alone. My past is boring. Orphaned seamstress, remember? I don't believe that for a moment. You learned sign language fluently in 5 years. You've revolutionized my daughter's life. You stand up to duchesses and handle imperial courts without flinching. Nothing about you is boring. Marguerite stumbled slightly, and he caught her closer. They were standing too near now, close enough that she could see the silver threaded through his black hair, the exact shade of grey in his eyes. "Alexandre," she whispered, forgetting titles and propriety. "We can't." "I know." But he didn't step back. "We can't. It's impossible. He paused, searching for words. "You're so far above me in the ways that matter, and I'm trapped by birth into a role that makes this impossible. You have it backward. So I'm a seamstress. You're a woman who saved my daughter's life, who saved my life, though you might not realize it. These past 2 months, I felt like a human being again, instead of a grieving ghost. And that's because of you. It's because of Sophie, because you're finally able to be her father. It's both." His hand tightened on her waist. "Don't pretend you don't feel this too. I see it in your eyes when you look at me. I see it in the way you smile when I enter a room." "What I feel doesn't matter." Marguerite forced herself to step back, breaking their contact. "I'm your employee. You're a prince. There's no world in which this could work. What if I didn't care about that? But you should care. Your family, your position, Sophie's future, all of it would be jeopardized by whatever this is." "And what is this?" He moved closer again, his voice low and intense. "Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll stop. Tell me I'm imagining it, and I'll never mention it again." Marguerite wanted to lie. She should lie. But standing there in the moonlight with music drifting around them, she couldn't force the words out. "I can't tell you that," she whispered. "But I can tell you that it doesn't change anything. We're from different worlds, Alexandra. No matter what I feel, that reality remains." Before he could respond, they heard Sophie's laughter approaching. They stepped apart quickly, putting proper distance between them just as Sophie burst into the garden, signing excitedly about the mechanical birds. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Marguerite maintained careful distance from Alexandra, terrified that someone might notice the tension between them. But she was hyper-aware of him, where he stood, who he spoke to, how his eyes kept finding her across crowded rooms. In the carriage ride home, Sophie fell asleep against Marguerite's shoulder, exhausted by her first grand ball. Alexandra sat across from them, his eyes on Marguerite's face in the dim light. "We should talk," he said quietly. "There's nothing to say. There's everything to say. Tomorrow, please." Marguerite nodded because refusing felt impossible. Tomorrow they would talk, and she would make him understand why they had to maintain their distance. Tomorrow she would be sensible and practical. Tonight she let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if the world were different, if she were someone who could love a prince without it being impossible. The morning after the ball, Duchess Margot returned to the Valmont Palace, and this time she brought reinforcements. Marguerite was in the library with Sophie reviewing vocabulary when Madame Duchamp appeared with a summons from Alexandre. His mother-in-law wished to speak with him, and he'd requested that Marguerite join them. Marguerite's stomach sank. Nothing good would come of this meeting. The blue salon was crowded with people who looked like they'd come for a trial. Duchess Margot sat in the center like a judge, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, lawyers from their appearance. Alexandre stood by the window, his posture rigid with tension. "Ah, Mademoiselle Beaumont," Margot said coldly. "How convenient. We can now discuss this situation with all parties present." "What situation would that be?" Alexandra asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The situation where you've allowed a common seamstress to infiltrate your household, live under your roof unmarried, and spend inappropriate amounts of time alone with you. A situation that is now the talk of all Paris. Marguerite is Sophie's teacher. She's an opportunist who saw a wealthy widower and a vulnerable child and seized her chance." Margot's voice cut like a blade. "Last night's spectacle at the Tuileries only confirmed what I've been saying for weeks. The way you looked at that girl, Alexandra, the way she looked at you, it was improper at best, scandalous at worst." Marguerite felt her face burn. Had they been that obvious? "You're seeing things that aren't there," Alexandra said. "Am I? Then why is half the imperial court speculating about when you'll make her your mistress? Why are people suggesting that you've already dishonored both her and your late wife's memory?" "That's enough." Alexandra's control finally snapped. "You will not speak about Marguerite that way. She's done nothing wrong. She's been nothing but honorable and kind and—" And you're in love with her. Margot's words dropped like stones into still water. Don't bother denying it. It's written all over your face. The grieving prince fallen for his daughter's poor little teacher. How utterly predictable. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marguerite couldn't look at Alexandra, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was in love with her? Or was that just Margot's accusation? What I feel is irrelevant, Alexandra finally said. Marguerite stays because Sophie needs her. Then make it proper. Margot gestured to the lawyers. These gentlemen have drawn up two options. First, you can send the girl away with a generous severance and find a suitable governess, someone older, married, unquestionably respectable, to continue Sophie's education. Or second, you can marry Mademoiselle Beaumont. Marguerite gasped. What? You heard me. If you insist on keeping her here, if you refuse to see sense, then marry her and make the situation legal. It will still be a scandal, a prince marrying a seamstress, but at least it won't be a moral outrage. You can't be serious, Marguerite said, finding her voice. Marriage? That's insane. Is it? Margot turned her cold gaze on Marguerite. You've been living as a wife in all but name for 2 months, dining with the prince, raising his child, sharing intimate evening hours. Marriage would simply make official what you've already taken for yourself. I haven't taken anything. Marguerite was shaking with anger now. I came here to help Sophie, that's all. I never intended. But you did intend, Margot interrupted. Perhaps not at first, but you've allowed feelings to develop. You've encouraged his attachment. Don't pretend to be innocent in this. She is innocent, Alexandra said forcefully. Marguerite has been nothing but professional. If anyone has been inappropriate, it's me. I'm the one who asked her to dance. I'm the one who's been... He stopped, seeming to realize he was about to confess something damaging. Margot smiled grimly. So you admit it. You have feelings for her. Alexandra looked at Marguerite then, really looked at her, and something in his eyes made her heart stop. Yes, he said quietly, I have feelings for her. I'm not going to lie about it anymore. Your Highness, Marguerite whispered, horrified. Don't. Why not? She's right. I'm in love with you, Marguerite. I have been for weeks. Maybe since the first day when you knelt down and gave my daughter her voice back. He turned to Margot. So yes, I have feelings for her, but that doesn't change the impossibility of the situation. I'm a prince. She's a seamstress. Marriage between us would be scandalous, Margot finished, but possible and infinitely preferable to the alternative, which is that you continue this charade and destroy both your reputations in the process. I won't marry her just to avoid scandal. Alexandra's jaw was set. Marguerite deserves better than that. She deserves someone who can offer her a normal life, not a circus of gossip and social ostracism. Then send her away. No. Alexandra, be reasonable. No. His voice rose. I won't send her away. Sophie needs her. He stopped, breathing hard. I need her, and I don't care what Paris thinks about it. Margot stood, gathering her things. Then you leave me no choice. I'll use every connection I have to make your life uncomfortable. I'll ensure that Imperial Court closes its doors to you. I'll see to it that Sophie's future is compromised by your stubbornness. If you won't protect your daughter's reputation, I will. She swept from the room, her lawyers following like shadows. In the silence that followed, Marguerite couldn't move. Alexandra had just declared his love for her in front of witnesses. He'd chosen her over his family's approval, and in doing so he'd made everything infinitely worse. I'm leaving, she said, her voice barely audible. Alexandra spun to face her. What? I'm leaving. Tonight. All of this, is my fault. I never should have stayed. I should have known better. Marguerite, no, yes! She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Your mother-in-law is right. I let this happen. I let myself care about Sophie, about you, and now I've destroyed everything. Sophie will suffer for this. Your reputation will suffer, all because I was selfish enough to stay. You're not selfish. You're the least selfish person I've ever met. Then let me do this one selfless thing. Let me leave before I cause more damage. She ran from the room before he could stop her. In her bedroom, she threw clothes into the small bag she'd arrived with 2 months ago. She'd accumulated some things, gifts from Sophie, the beautiful green dress from the ball, but she left them behind. They belonged to a life that had never really been hers. Sophie found her as she was finishing. The child took one look at the bag and her face crumpled. You're leaving, she signed, her hands trembling. I have to. Why? Because of mean grandmother? Because I'm causing problems for you and your father. Because people are gossiping and that gossip will hurt you. I don't care about gossip. Sophie's signs were sharp, angry. I care about you. You promised you wouldn't leave. You promised? I know, I'm sorry. But staying would hurt you more in the long run. You're wrong. Sophie was fully crying now. You leaving is what will hurt. Please, Marguerite, please don't go. It took every ounce of strength Marguerite possessed to pry Sophie's hands from her dress and slip out the door. The child's sobs followed her down the corridor, each one a knife to her heart. She made it to the servants' entrance before Alexandre caught her. He was breathless, as if he'd run. Don't, he said, please don't do this. I have to. Why? Because my mother-in-law is a bitter old woman who can't stand to see anyone happy. Because society has rules about who can love whom. Because Sophie deserves a father who isn't social pariah. Because you deserve a life without scandal. Because you're afraid, Alexandra interrupted. You're afraid that if you stay, you'll have to admit that you love me too. Marguerite's breath caught. That's not fair. None of this is fair, but it's true, isn't it? He stepped closer. You do love me, even though it's impossible, even though it goes against every rule of sense and propriety. She wanted to deny it, should deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Say it, he urged softly. Just once, tell me the truth. I love you. The words tore from her throat. God help me, I love you. And that's exactly why I have to leave, because loving you will destroy everything you've worked for, everything Sophie needs. Sophie needs you more than she needs my pristine reputation. Right now, yes, but in 5 years, 10, when she's old enough to understand what it cost her to have me in her life, when she realizes that society won't fully accept her because her father married beneath his station. Society is already struggling to accept her because she's deaf, Alexandra said bluntly. My marriage to you wouldn't change that. What would change is that she'd have someone who genuinely loves her, who understands her, who will fight for her no matter what. Her father can do that. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about you becoming her mother. Not just her teacher or her friend, but her actual mother. He took both her hands, holding them tightly. Marry me, Marguerite. The world tilted. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. Marry me. Not because of scandal or social pressure, but because I love you. Because I want to wake up next to you every morning. Because I want Sophie to have a mother who sees her the way Eloise did, as perfect and whole and extraordinary. Alexandra, think about what you're saying. I've thought of nothing else for weeks. He pulled her closer. I know it will be difficult. I know there will be gossip and judgment and people who cut us from their social circles. But I don't care about any of that. I care about you, about Sophie, about building a life that's based on love rather than obligation. Marguerite was crying again, torn between hope and despair. Your family will never accept me. Margot will come around eventually, and if she doesn't, we'll manage without her approval. The imperial court has survived bigger scandals than a prince marrying for love. I'm a seamstress. You're a woman of courage, intelligence, compassion and strength. Your origins don't define you. The world will say you married beneath yourself. The world would be wrong. Alexandra cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. You're not beneath me, Marguerite. If anything, I'm trying to become worthy of you. She looked into his eyes and saw no doubt there, no hesitation, just love, pure and certain and terrifying in its intensity. If I say yes, she whispered, there's no going back. You'll be married to a commoner, forever. If you say yes, I'll be married to the woman I love, forever. He smiled. That sounds perfect to me. Marguerite thought of Sophie, sobbing in her room. She thought of the child's joy these past 2 months, the way she'd blossomed with love and attention. She thought of Alexandra's hands learning to sign, his dedication to his daughter, the man he was beneath the princely facade. She thought of the life they could have together, unconventional, scandalous, imperfect, but real, built on something genuine rather than social expectations. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I'll marry you. Alexandra's smile could have lit all of Paris. He kissed her then, right there in the servants' hallway, with no thought for propriety or who might see. It was everything a first kiss should be, desperate and joyful and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, Alexandra was laughing. We should tell Sophie before she cries herself sick. They found the child still in Marguerite's bedroom, curled on the floor beside the abandoned bag. When she saw them enter together, hope bloomed on her tear-stained face. I'm staying, Marguerite signed, for always, because your father and I are getting married. Sophie's shriek of joy was loud enough to bring servants running. She launched herself at both of them, wrapping her arms around their necks and signing so fast her hands blurred. "Really, really, truly? You'll be my new maman?" "Really, truly," Marguerite confirmed, and Sophie squeezed her tighter. Alexandre watched them both with an expression of such pure contentment that Marguerite felt her heart might burst. This was right. However scandalous, however improper, this was exactly right. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, and it was nothing like Marguerite had imagined. Alexandre had wanted something private, intimate, just family and close friends. But word had spread through Paris like wildfire. The Prince de Valmont was marrying his daughter's seamstress teacher, and suddenly everyone wanted to see the spectacle. In the end, they compromised. The ceremony itself was small, held in the palace's private chapel, with only a handful of witnesses. Sophie served as Marguerite's only attendant, dressed in pale pink and beaming with joy. Duchess Margot attended, her presence a surprise. She'd come to Alexandre the week before with a stiff apology. "Eloise would have approved of you," she'd told Marguerite. "My daughter always valued character over status. I was wrong to let my bitterness cloud my judgment." It wasn't a warm reconciliation, but it was a beginning. The ceremony was brief. Marguerite wore a simple ivory dress she'd sewn herself, with flowers in her hair that Sophie had picked from the garden. When Alexandra slipped the ring on her finger and signed "I love you" where everyone could see, she felt like the luckiest woman in France. The reception, however, was a different matter. Alexandra had been forced to invite half the imperial court, and they came, partly out of genuine affection, partly out of curiosity about the scandalous bride. Marguerite moved through the crowds with Sophie at her side, translating conversations, introducing the child to people who were finally willing to see her as more than an affliction. "You're brave," one duchess told Marguerite bluntly, "marrying a prince while remaining so yourself." "I don't know how to be anyone else," Marguerite replied honestly. "Good. The aristocracy could use more honesty and less pretense." As the evening wore on, Marguerite found herself alone for a moment in the palace garden. The same garden where Alexandra had asked her to dance, where everything had begun to shift between them. "Hiding from your own wedding?" Alexandra's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him leaning against a tree, jacket unbuttoned, cravat loosened. He looked more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Just taking a moment to breathe. It's overwhelming. Having regrets?" "Not even one." She crossed to him, slipping into his arms easily. "Though I keep expecting someone to tell me this is all a dream. If it is, we're dreaming together." He kissed her forehead. "How's Sophie handling everything?" "She's in her element, currently explaining sign language to a very patient countess." Alexandra laughed. "That's my girl, changing the world one conversation at a time." They stood quietly for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the music and laughter from the reception. "Thank you," Alexandra said finally. "For what?" "For saying yes, for taking a chance on this impossible situation, for loving my daughter as fiercely as you love me. Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me, not as a seamstress or a teacher, but as just me. There's nothing just about you, mon cœur. You're extraordinary." A small figure burst into the garden, Sophie slightly disheveled, her flower crown askew. She signed urgently, "People are asking for you both. They want to toast the bride and groom." "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting," Alexandre said. He offered one arm to Marguerite, the other to Sophie, and they walked back to the reception together. As they entered the ballroom, someone started applauding. Then another person joined in, and another, until the entire room was clapping for the unconventional couple who dared to marry for love rather than status. It wasn't universal approval. Marguerite could see disapproving faces scattered throughout the crowd, but it was more acceptance than she'd expected. The toast was made by an elderly general who'd known Alexandra since childhood. "To Prince Alexandre and his bride," he declared. "May they continue to show us that sometimes the best choices are the unexpected ones. And to Lady Sophie, who has taught this old soldier that communication has nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with listening." Sophie understood the toast through Marguerite's translation and signed back, "Tell him thank you and that I like his medals." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine. People began to relax, to accept this new reality. Their prince had married a seamstress, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, something beautiful had begun. 5 years had changed everything, and nothing at all. Marguerite stood in the same palace garden where Alexandra had first asked her to dance, watching Sophie play with her younger brother. At 12, Sophie was tall for her age, confident, articulate in both spoken French and sign language. She'd become something of a celebrity, the deaf daughter of a prince who refused to let her disability define her. The garden was full of children today, all deaf or hard of hearing, all students at the program Marguerite had established with the Institut National de Jeunes Sourds. It had been her passion project for the past 3 years, using Alexandra's resources and connections to create educational opportunities for deaf children from all social classes. "Sign language lessons tomorrow at 2, Sophie was telling a younger girl. "I'll teach you the alphabet again and then we'll practice animals." The younger girl grinned and signed, "Thank you, Lady Sophie. You're the best teacher." Marguerite felt arms wrap around her waist from behind. "Watching them never gets old," Alexandra murmured. She leaned back against him, one hand covering his. The other hand rested on her swollen belly. She was 6 months pregnant with their third child. Their son, Henri, now 3 years old, had been born hearing, much to everyone's relief. This new baby's hearing wouldn't be known until after birth, but Marguerite had already decided it didn't matter. Whether the child could hear or not, they would be loved and supported. Sophie asked if she could teach sign language at the institute 1 day a week. Marguerite said, "She wants to help other children the way I helped her." "Of course she does. She learned from the best." Alexandra kissed her temple. "What did you tell her?" "That she can start next month if her studies don't suffer." She was so excited she nearly signed my arm off. They watched Sophie gathering the children for a game, her hands moving in fluid, expressive signs that every child understood. The scene was peaceful, domestic, perfect. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexandra asked quietly. "The scandal, the gossip, everything you gave up to marry me?" Marguerite turned in his arms to face him. Even after 5 years, he could still make her breath catch. "I didn't give up anything that mattered. And what I gained," she gestured to Sophie, to Henri playing nearby, to the home they'd built together. "This was worth any amount of scandal. The Countess de Beauharnais told me last week that we'd started a trend. Apparently 2 other aristocrats have married inappropriately and cited our marriage as inspiration. Are we revolutionaries now?" "Only in the best way." He pulled her closer, as close as her pregnant belly would allow. "I love you in case I haven't mentioned it today. You mentioned it twice at breakfast and once when I couldn't reach the top shelf in the library. Then this makes 4 times. I'm aiming for 20 before dinner." Sophie noticed them and came running over, signing as she approached. "Stop being romantic. The children are watching and making faces." "Good," Alexandra signed back. "Let them see that love is something to celebrate, not hide." Sophie rolled her eyes in the universal gesture of children everywhere who find their parents embarrassing. Then she smiled and signed, "I'm glad you married Marguerite, Papa. She makes everything better." "I know, ma petite, I know." As the afternoon sun slanted through the garden, painting everything gold, Marguerite looked around at the life she'd built. A prince's wife, a mother, an educator and advocate. But more than any title, she was simply herself, the seamstress who'd learned sign language in a deaf school and used it to bridge an impossible gap. The children's laughter filled the air, a sound both hearing and deaf children could share in their own ways. And in that moment, Marguerite understood that she'd given Sophie more than a voice all those years ago. She'd given herself a family, a purpose, and a love that defied every social convention. Sophie was teaching the youngest children a new sign, her hands patient and encouraging. Henri toddled over to join them, his small hands trying to mimic his sister's movements. Alexandra's arm stayed around Marguerite's waist, steady and sure. The world had said their love was impossible. Society had claimed it would never work. But standing there in the garden, surrounded by the life they'd created together, Marguerite knew that sometimes the impossible things were worth believing in. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible became real, and when it did, it was more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The end.